One.
Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I am your host, Stephen Falgout.
And I am your other host, Dawn Falgu. Get Recc'd is our podcast where Stephen and I, two siblings, get together and recommend two pieces of media to each other, whether it be a film, an album, a video game, or whatever. And then the next podcast, we discuss each other's recommendations.
Think you're a little quiet. Might want to bump yourself up a bit.
Am I quiet? Does it sound quiet to you? I don't. I just tested it from this direction. I should be good.
Yeah, I'm listening. I'm listening on the live feed here.
Okay, well, that is a better
Which
test than anything. There you go, I'm boosted. Now I might be incredibly loud, but you know what?
thank you everyone. Anyone who's in the live chat. Of course, we always do these podcasts live. If you're listening on Castbox right now, you can join us on YouTube at the Casting 404 channel on a schedule that is not really ever predetermined, and we don't really tell you ahead of time. So just always be looking out for it.
Yeah,
This podcast really is fortnightly, except now that Fortnite has gotten too big, we don't like to associate ourselves with it anymore. So that's why we don't have a consistent schedule.
yeah, and
So take that, Epic Games.
it is worth noting that Fortnite was not big in the last couple of years we've been doing this, but just this week, just this last week anyway, it really blew up, and now we're a little too cool for it.
Yeah, it was really a small indie game. But finally it's really come out of its shell. I mean, before it was just a game where it was like kind of like a tower defense. And they just yesterday created a battle royale mode. So now it's kind of blowing up. So we don't like to associate ourselves with it anymore.
Yeah, and it's also really funny because we were always big fans. That's why we've made many joke references to Fortnite on countless podcasts before. But we just assumed that nobody listening knew what the fuck we were talking about. And we were actually right. We were we were two of maybe 5 people who played it until like last Friday or so. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, it was us and Ninja. And now Ninja's gotten too big and won't squad up with us anymore. Now that it's really kind of blown up, unfortunately.
I also don't think Ninja is going to come on our podcast.
No, I don't think so. But you win some, you lose some. That's what I always say.
Well, I just want to apologize to the Get Recc'd fandom. If you were looking forward to our Ninja guest appearance, that is not happening.
Yeah, we will have an actual ninja though on the podcast, so be looking forward to that. We're going to interview a ninja.
Yeah, and that is not what I recommended to you last time, Stephen. Would you like to get into that?
No, but just like a ninja creeps up from you from the shadows, your recommendation really crept up on me. And that recommendation was Cavalcade by Black Midi, of course.
Yes, and Black Midi is a experimental rock band from England, and they garnered a lot of hype a couple years ago. I think they got a lot of hype for their debut, which I think happened because they were a popular live band in the press, and when their debut dropped, it was kind of a big deal. This is now their follow-up this year in 2021, and I won't say any more about it. I will just let Steven talk about it.
This one was tough for me. I feel like I didn't really get it. I had a hard time really comprehending it. I think this one is one of those, and we've talked about a couple of ones like this before, where I feel like even the amount of time that I spent with it wasn't enough. Like, I feel like if I gave it even more listens through than I've already have, maybe it would gel with me a little bit more. But right now, it kind of turned me off. I appreciate what it's doing. I will say that. And there's a lot of good tracks on here that I really enjoyed. The other thing that I'll mention is it reminded me a lot at some times of like a Trout Mask replica kind of thing, and then at other times very much akin to like classic traditional prog rock. Like I felt like influence of like a Rush in there, but I don't feel like those things ever melded well for me. And like I'm thinking, even going from track 1 to track 2, with John L. to Marlene Dietrich, I feel like the juxtaposition between those tracks was so stark that I had a hard time really grasping the entire album. And a lot of the tracks kind of follow that format. It's almost like, from what I felt like, it's almost like the album was bookended by some really kind of experimental, like off-tempo sort of stuff. Like I mentioned, kind of like reminding me a lot of like a Trout Mask replica with tracks like John L. and like the last 2 tracks. And then in the middle, what I felt was more, your kind of traditional prog rock. So I don't know. Like I said, I appreciate what it was doing. I did like some of the tracks on here. But for the most part, it just didn't vibe with me, I don't feel like.
Well, it definitely takes from the more experimental acts in prog. Like it stuff like 70s King Crimson, or like some of the stuff that Frank Zappa did and stuff like that. But it also, I mean, and I understand why this is confusing to hear, because they definitely have like 2 sides to that sound on this album, and they play between them in, I think, a pretty interesting way. Like, I like the dynamic they have on this record, and it's true that John L. into Marlene Dietrich is kind of the first place you see it, which is nice because it's the first 2 tracks. You go from John L., which might be the craziest track here. It's definitely the most Trout Mask replica type track. Like that comparison, I think, follows for this song for sure, because it's got like a very zany melodic line that's feels kind of asynchronous to certain parts. Like everything's in lockstep with this rhythm, but the rhythm is so strange, and the melody is so strange that it's a bit hard to follow. And they do a lot of crazy like start-stop stuff during the song to make the structure hard to follow. But then you go into Marlene Dietrich, which it's kind of like a ballad. But what I do like is that I feel like there's a good through line between these elements, and I feel like that's the vocalist. He's very wacky. Like all across this album, he's very wacky, and even in the moments where he kind of croons, because he's got some crooner in him on some of these tracks, and I like that in those songs. He still sounds odd. In Marlene Dietrich, he's doing like a funny voice, like almost like a theater showman type dude, maybe somebody with like a long cane. And in other songs, he's got like this more of a softness, but there's always something just kind of odd about his vocals. I think like that's the element for me that makes everything kind of gel. And it is nice also to have like moments of reprieve, even though for me, the stuff I enjoyed the most on Cavalcade was definitely when they were going just batshit insane, which they do quite well. But I also think they do it with purpose. Most of the songs, pretty much every song except for John L. has a good range to it. Like John L. and Hogwash and Boulder Dash, I guess, are the 2 that just go apeshit the whole time. But I liked that on a lot of the other tracks, keeping in that sort of avant prog tradition. There's a structure to it. It's an odd structure, but there's a structure to restraining that chaos to build good tension, to let like to let those moments where they just let loose really hit home. I think of like the track with the scientific name of like that illness or whatever. I don't know how to say it. Track 3, it does a really good job of that because it has a lot of moments of craziness, but it also has these moments where the band kind of gels together for a moment to give some kind of release. And I think the best example, and also my favorite track, is Slow in the middle, which just does a really good job of ebbing and flowing through these moments. Like, a lot of the song is quite restrained and has this kind of jazzy guitar melody. But they introduce these elements that come back later in the song much louder and much more intense at a very quiet level. So everything's kind of unexpected. I think what's nice is that they don't feel like they have a formula, which I like. Even a lot of prog bands, and I mean even like 70s Crimson, which I think some of this stuff is sort of similar to. What was nice about stuff like that, like an album like Lark's Tongues and Aspect or whatever, is that, you know, prog is known for being for having very complex song structures, but if you listen to a lot of it, you can definitely hear a lot of similarities in what those acts will do and how they carry a longer song. But I feel like in that era of like King Crimson and with stuff like this, they do a good job making it surprising. So those structures make sense musically and they feel good, but they also aren't easy to predict. And you know, even songs that that have pretty simple elements of tension and release still do it in a way where it is harder to follow and it keeps it a lot more interesting, I think. But I also think, to what you said, I can understand why it also makes it harder to even get a grasp of what's going on. Because I don't feel like there's a song here that plays it safe in a way where it's, even for like, you know, a crazy experimental album, where it makes it easy to like latch on to something musically.
Yeah, and very much in the prog style. The other thing is just like, speaking of the musicality, there's a ton of instrumentation here. That is the one thing that I feel like I appreciated the most, because also all that instrumentation is just incredible. Like, they're playing the hell out of these instruments for sure. And like, I'm looking at, you know, I often look at the Wikipedia pages and I'm looking at just the sheer number of instruments, such as the table salt shaker. And when I saw that, I was like, yeah, that makes 100% sense. But all of that is just like flowing so well. I think my favorite track, actually, and this is honestly surprising to me because I think we talked about it before, like, I'm typically don't really enjoy longer tracks, like tracks with longer run times. But my favorite track on this was actually Ascending Forth, which is the last track. I just feel like there's a lot of great stuff going on there. That was the one that really clicked with me. And some of the other tracks, like kind of in the middle of the track list, like you mentioned, Slow. Some of the other tracks there, like tracks 3, Slow, even Hogwash and Bordeaux Dash, actually, I liked quite a bit. I just think that's like, you know, like I said before, it's almost like the juxtaposition of all of the sounds. I don't know, I just didn't connect with it. But not to give the impression that I didn't like this. I just feel like I didn't like it as much as I could have, or maybe have liked things that are kind of in a similar oeuvre that we've talked about in the past as much.
Yeah, I totally get that. I think, like, I personally, I think the thing I like the least about this album is I do think, although I mentioned how I like the variety and the dynamics between some of these softer tracks and some of these crazier tracks, which is good. It's a good album structure. It always works on a track list, you know, good sequencing, lows and highs, that sort of thing. But I do think some of the lows aren't, to me, as interesting as the highs, and I do include Ascending Forth in that. I think Ascending Forth has a great conclusion, like a really good conclusion. And it's a great, satisfying end to the album. But over the whole course of the like 9 minutes of the track, it doesn't feel like it's building toward anything until like the last 2 minutes, when suddenly it starts building to something. which is fine. It just I don't like it as much as some of the other songs, and I feel the same way about I feel a similar way about like Diamond stuff, which is a pretty similar track to Ascending Forth. It also is kind of soft and it gradually builds into like a more open, louder section. But that song does that throughout its entire runtime. But I don't ever feel like it completely sticks its own landing. And Marlene Dietrich kind of feels like an interlude. You know, it's a good track. I like the story that's presented on it and the way it's told. But the song itself isn't really that great. Like for me, I really liked when everything was just firing off at all cylinders, which they do a really good job of on this album. And I think that's kind of their aesthetic. I never listened to their debut. I heard songs off of it though. It was very popular when it came out. And while this is definitely a completely like different album, I do still hear that between both. I really like when the band just kind of rips. They're great at playing their instruments, and they're also great at handling dynamics. And they can do a lot of crazy stuff, and they're especially rhythmically. Their drummer also is just insane, and the drumming on this album too is so good. And so when all that stuff comes together in some of the louder songs, that was definitely the stuff that I liked more. That being said, though, I do think it's a really well-rounded album.
Just want to mention, I don't know if you've heard this, but now I definitely need to hear this. Apparently, the band had some cover tracks that were like a bonus for pre-ordered vinyl copies. Those covers were Moonlight on Vermont by Captain Beefheart. Makes sense to me.
Oh, wow, I didn't know.
We've already talked about, I feel like there's definitely influence there. 21st Century Schizoid Man by King Crimson. Again, makes sense. We've talked about it. And then it gets weird. You ready for this? Okay. Love Story by Taylor Swift. Nothing Compares to You by Prince. A medley of Psycho Killer and Roxanne.
Okay, all of those I get except for Taylor Swift.
I need to hear those. I don't know what.
But that's interesting.
Especially the Taylor Swift one. I need to know what's going on there.
I with a band like this, you would expect that to be ironic, but I have a feeling it's not ironic, the Taylor Swift cover. But like Talking Heads, I can see that. This is an influence of Black Midi, and this is something that they're known for that you don't hear on this album. But on their first album, and also albums from bands in the same scene, because there's this kind of scene in England right now, of bands like Black Midi. Not exactly like them, but they're similar bands. They're working with like post-rock, Slint-ish. They always get compared to Slint. I don't think it's fair, but like that kind of post-hardcore, as opposed to like Fugazi, I guess, and experimental rock. Bands like Black Country New Road and Squid and Black Midi are like the three that I can think of because they're the three most popular right now. But anyway, they're all known for being like the strong post-punk influence. So like influence from bands like Talking Heads, and Television, and whatever else. But yeah, so I'm not surprised that they covered Talking Heads. But that is something about this album too, is that like I think it is cool to know that Black Midi has made their second album and they already decided to like take on completely different influences than they took on the first time. I think that means pretty exciting things for them in the future, and also knowing that they'll cover like Taylor Swift. It makes you wonder. It makes you wonder where they're going next. But I think that I see pretty big things for them, as if they aren't already like getting massive acclaim with this album and the last one, which they are.
I was just looking if I can find the cover on YouTube, and I don't know if I have found it, but I definitely am interested to know what that sounds like.
You gotta buy the vinyl.
Yes, I do. Well, I had to pre-order it. It's too late.
Oh, God.
Yeah, it was a pre-order bonus. So.
Anyway, we can wrap it up if you're ready to.
Sure. Yeah, like I said, I don't dislike this thing. I just don't feel like it gelled with me as much as it could. I feel like the juxtaposition between some of what was going on in different tracks felt disjointed to me. and not necessarily cohesive. But I did like a lot of the tracks on here. I talked about some of them. And I think that, generally I really appreciate what's going on. But ultimately, I think I give it something like, I don't know, I don't want to be too harsh on it. So I'd probably say like a 7. Like I liked it more than neutral. But I feel like there's more going on here. And I think that with additional listens, I might be able to kind of parse some of that. I think I recommend it as well.
Yeah, I would give it an 8. I think that I think it's a really fun kind of experimental rock album. I don't think it's too heady. I don't think it's too out there. And in that sense, I would put it in a league like Trout Mask Replica, minus the 2 out there, because that one might be too out there for a lot of people. But it's fun, you know. There are things about it that can be taken seriously. We didn't even get into the lyrics, which I don't think they're a standout, but there are tracks with some pretty interesting lyrics, and musically, it's very studied, but it doesn't come across that way. I think they're able to make a lot of that craziness very fun and in that way even kind of accessible. I feel like you could be someone who's never touched experimental music in your life and you could enjoy this album, although probably fairly passively and maybe a bit reserved. But, it seems more like it wants to be entertaining and enjoyable to listen to than other experimental music might. And I think that's one of their big appeals. I think that's, similar to what was appealing to a lot of people about, like, completely different band, but about, like, Death Grips back in the early 2010s. They were definitely strange. They were experimental. They were noisy. But they were fun. And a lot of people were able to get behind that. I also think it's just cool to see, like, some rock bands who are, like, garnering, acclaim, and a lot of people are listening to them and talking about them. And I think that's cool because that's definitely not been something that we've seen a lot for quite a lot of years. And I think that is nice that that's beginning to happen. But yeah, like, I don't think the album's perfect or amazing. I just think they do what they do really well. And it's a well-structured album and it's pretty enjoyable. And I do recommend it. That's all about that one. So do you want to move on to what you recommended to me, Steven?
Yes, so last time I recommended you the 1989 film Back to the Future 2, obviously the sequel to Back to the Future 1. Back to the Future 2, now they actually go to the future. Whereas, I guess, like in the first one, they really went to the past, but then they went back to the future, but in this case, the future was the present. Now they're actually going to the future and then coming back and then also going back to the... Anyway, I'll pass it off to you to talk about Back to the Future Part 2.
So I will start by saying that I had never seen Back to the Future before.
Wait, not even the first one?
Not even the first one. Now, don't worry, I did watch it in preparation for this. But no, I had not seen it, and the only Back to the Future I'd ever seen was the beginning of this movie, which, when I was a kid, I had a DVD of it, and I used to watch it in the car, but only the beginning. And the only stuff I remembered was that there was a hoverboard, and there was Jaws 3D. Like a big Jaws CG thing.
Which looks hilarious.
It does look hilarious. It looks hilarious. There's a lot that's hilarious about that I'm sure we'll get to, but yeah, I'd never seen the first one, so I finally took it upon myself to watch the first one before watching this. I'm very glad I did that because this is a sequel. Like this directly follows the last movie. This is so indebted to the first movie in ways that are great and not so great. But if you have not seen the first movie, this film, I cannot imagine it would have much worth to you at all. Whereas there are sequels and other franchises that can definitely be watched on their own. I don't think this one can. So anyway, I want to say really quickly about the first Back to the Future. I'm very glad I watched that. I think that's definitely like one of the best fun kind of popcorn type of movies I have ever seen. Like the script for that movie is just so tight. It is airtight, which is amazing for a time travel story because time travel stories are like inherently flimsy. And there are plot holes in the first film. It's inevitable. You can't avoid it with time travel as a plot element. It's just going to happen. But they don't, none of that matters. There's nothing there's no questions you have to ask in Back to the Future 1. There's just nothing. It's so tight. The script is so good. And there's so many setups and payoffs throughout that movie that work so well. I say all of this in contrast to part 2, which also does have some of these elements. And I will say right off the bat, I was not expecting to like this movie. I did like it. As for why I wasn't expecting to, I don't know. I just assumed people didn't like it, but apparently that's not true. I guess I just thought that. Maybe it's the third one that people don't like or something, but I guess people do generally like this movie. I don't know where I heard that people don't. But anyway, I did like it. But in contrast to pretty much everything I said about the first film, this movie's definitely not as airtight. The time travel questions that rise up definitely are a little bit worse in this one because they convolute the time travel mechanic a ton, especially when you compare it to the first movie, which is so simple. This one, a lot of stuff happens with the time travel, which makes sense. You know, they wanted to expand on that in the sequel, and this movie does feel bigger than the first movie, which can be a good thing and a bad thing. But I think one of the negative things about that is that it does start to get a little bit complicated. And when you're working with time travel, you really have to be careful not to complicate things. There's nothing wrong with a complicated plot, and I do think this movie is pretty easy to follow. But again, you're working with a plot element that is like notoriously difficult to make sense of. And those problems do arise. I talked for a while, so you can comment.
Yeah, I agree. I think that especially when you're thinking about or talking about specifically the time travel elements, this movie also kind of like tries to describe some elements of time travel, but then breaks its own rules in the context of the film, which I don't know, still makes some scenarios kind of fun. But I'm thinking about specifically like, you know, the doc here. He is very specific in telling people like, don't see your other versions of yourself. Like we could create a time paradox, and then that's like almost thrown away immediately. And those things, it's like if you're gonna, the introduction of those things is just kind of like I feel like a bigger, you know, one microcosm of a bigger problem that you're talking about, where they try to create more rules around their system versus around just kind of letting their system play out naturally. And the other thing is just like generally, the first film is very contained in one time period. You know, it's like a very straightforward, this is our objective, we're going to go do that, and then come back. With this film, the initial objective is like kind of fuzzy generally, and then it gets convoluted because, you know, the wrong hands are getting the DeLorean, which is the time machine, and then they're going back in time and it's not the right time they expect, and then they go back in time again to basically the first movie, like literally, and it just kind of gets all over the place. Now, I love that ride though. I think it's a super fun ride. I think they play with a lot of stuff that's really interesting going from the first film to the second film. I love that Biff, kind of the school bully, becomes this really important character again in a really different, interesting way. But also some of it feels a little hammy, and also a lot of it feels definitely like an aspect of its time. Like I don't think a lot of that whole Biff stuff would really fly now, the way that it's presented, especially like in this manner where this was really kind of a kid's movie, to be honest. But generally, I just think like, you know, these characters are just such a fun group of characters to see have these exploits. And there's a lot of kind of hokey comedy, there's a lot of slapstick kind of comedy, but it all works in the context of these films. And this one specifically, I just like the different locations that they go to, even though it does feel kind of all over the place. But specifically, like that whole future scene is just a ton of fun. And you think about it in the context of the time, you have kind of I want to call it almost like the antithesis of this future scenario, which is that kind of like cyberpunk Blade Runner future, very dystopian. And then this is just so much more lighthearted and fun, so much more colorful, and all of that just kind of plays really well, I feel like.
Yeah, definitely. I only meant to start with some criticisms because I'm comparing it to the first film, but it's often not a great idea to compare sequels to the original because they almost never stack up. That's just kind of inherent. But on its own, I mean, it is actually a very fun movie. And one of the things that's nice is that even though it is complicating things a lot, I don't think it's overcomplicating things. This story still actually stays remarkably easy to follow, considering how many things they're working with, which is an impressive feat in itself. In the first film, you don't have that problem at all. It's easy to follow just by itself. They don't really mess with a lot. In this movie, there's so many different times they're traveling to, and characters to focus on, and things to consider in every scene. There's scenes where characters have to take 3 things into account at once, and you're expected to follow all of that, but it's so easy to. I really think this script is also really good, all things considered. It's not as tight as the first, but considering that they up the ante with a lot of the time travel stuff, they still keep it quite breezy and easy to understand, which is really nice. It's definitely very important too, because there are points in the film where the focus changes completely, and I think the movie does a good job at keeping you along with that. Now, I will say from this point on, I don't see any way that we can not start spoiling things. So if you, for whatever reason, haven't seen this, like I hadn't, and you don't want to know, maybe don't listen. But like I said, this film is super indebted to the first, not just in that it follows the story directly and uses the same characters and things like that, but also, as Steven mentioned, there is a large portion of this movie takes place in the other movie. So they have the other movie happening in the background as the current movie is playing out in the same setting. And you can see the first movie happening in the distance at various points, as you're supposed to be following Marty the second time. Without explaining the whole plot, it's a little bit difficult to explain. But, that, I think, relied for me just a little bit, too much on the legend status of the first one. Now, this only came out 4 years later, or 5 years later. 5 years later, I think. But it's still, it knows that the audience is going into this already a big fan of the first Back to the Future, and it's, playing that up so much. I found it to be a little bit much, but with that said, it is still a very impressive sequence. And the effects in it hold up really well. And it also it's just really fun. It's very breezy and fast and paced really well. And, they call a little bit of attention to what happened in the first movie, but I think they actually do a pretty good job of keeping it in the background. Not just literally, but also writing wise. It doesn't really take the focus at any point. And you're given something else to focus on in these same scenes, which I thought was interesting play on it. But like I said, maybe a little bit much there. I would have definitely liked if this movie tried to do something a little bit more different than it did. which is odd to say considering I was complaining about how much they complicated things. But I'm not just talking about complicating it. I mean, like, there are exact story beats they just remake in this movie. You know, even in the future section, in the start of the film, they have it play out pretty much the same way a scene in the first film played out in that same setting, only in the past. Which, you know, is a cute callback, but it also leans a lot on you having seen the first film. It's fine, but yeah, I think a kind of problem there is that I feel like all those scenes were better in the first one. Not that I don't like the future stuff, it's just like really cartoony. And the first film never quite got that goofy, so I feel like this one definitely ups the goofiness a lot, which works in the film's style and comedy. But it does mean that this scene, I don't think, worked quite as well as the one in the first film.
Yeah, although I will say I do like conceptually and even on screen, honestly, I do like the idea of going back to like literally the events of the first film. Like I think that is very fun. But I agree, I do think it relies really heavily on one having seen the first film, but also just like the nostalgia of that first film. Um but I kind of like it. The other thing I'll say is it's fun, obviously, now looking back on the prediction of 2015, which was entirely accurate. It's kind of crazy, actually.
Oh yeah, and that actually was one of the most enjoyable things about watching it, is that I've never seen this before it was 2015, only after, and that made a lot of stuff really funny, because this is the most 80s 2015 you could possibly imagine, and it's dated in that way. But in fairness,
Yeah, but it's crazy how they got it right that we would all have hover cars and hoverboards. I mean, it's wild, really.
that's true. Yeah, it's kind of like The Simpsons. It predicts every historical event.
Mm-hmm.
But
I love my favorite thing is like the 1980s view of a 2015 house, which really just looks like a 1980s house
yeah,
with like some extra technology that is pretty hokey, honestly.
I love the fax machines. Like, that's
Yeah.
one thing the future will have, is just more fax machines.
Right. In every room, even in the closet.
Yeah, and about that scene as well. Jennifer, right? That's her name. She gets shafted in this movie. Like,
Oh, yeah.
they have to have her because that picks up from where the first film left off. But, you know, in the first film, that ending was, I don't think that was actually supposed to be like, oh, we're doing a sequel. It was just a fun cliffhanger ending. But they had to pick up from it perfectly, but they didn't really have anything for Jennifer to do. So she goes into this house and she sees what they're going to look like in the future, which you think is going to come into play, but it doesn't at all. And that's not even counting all the times in the movie she's just like knocked out. But even when she is awake, you know, we see some fun stuff in there, but it doesn't amount to anything. And while I'm okay with having a fun scene just for the sake of it, I kind of felt like that scene was pretty stupid, so I don't really know. And then after that point, she just disappears. You know, not a big deal, but for any of the Back to the Future Jennifer fans out there, I'm sure that was pretty disappointing. So the one other main thing about this film is how much of an increased role they give to Biff. You know, he was the main antagonist in the first film, but not like he is in this one. Because in this movie, he's like a super villain. And he's like the one who plots all this stuff that ends up causing the time rift continuum or whatever to go out of whack. And I do like that. And I think that Biff is such an intensely unlikable character that he is a good villain. It's why he worked in the first film. But by the same token, he's also such an intensely unlikable character that making him such the focus of parts in this film, like there's a section with Biff Tower, which is like his Trump Tower, I guess. Like that starts to make the movie a little bit unlikable in itself. And it's not just that it wouldn't fly today. I think it's just like it's really mean and ugly. And there was stuff like that in the first movie too. You know, and these movies are so light that it feels a little bit out of place. I think the good thing is that the movie's writing and pacing stays so fast and good that it still fits in. But in comparison to the first movie, I think the focus on Biff makes this one a little bit harder to be like totally on board with, because like he's just so awful, and especially in this scene it's just like, oh my god. These movies have a tiny bit of edginess to them for sure. They're not like the lightest of comedies ever, but I don't know, I felt like that was maybe a little bit much.
Yeah, I agree. That's kind of what I was alluding to earlier too. That specific scene. Watching that now, it's definitely a little much.
Overall, though, I've been making a lot of criticisms, and I guess it's because I'm constantly comparing it to the first movie in my head. But honestly, like,
yeah, although before we go on, I did want to say, I think I kind of mentioned it too, and you've sort of brought it up as well. But like generally, the the MacGuffin for the reason why they even go to the future is like so loose. Like honestly, I guess it's because his son ends up doing something and ends up in jail. But for that to be a reason enough for Doc Brown to go back to the past and bring Marty to the future to stop his son from doing that seems kind of like they just wanted an excuse to go to the future, really.
yeah, for sure. It's also because they had to think of something, because I believe the line in the ending of the first film is like, it's your parents or it's your kids. One or the other. It's your kids. That's what he says. So they had to think of something for the second movie about their kids. Yeah. And I don't think they thought about that line too much when they ended the first film. So it was like, now we just have to figure something out. And I definitely agree. That was weird.
It's kind of crazy, actually. I'm just looking at the Wikipedia. So Robert Zemeckis was actually away from a lot of the writing of the movie because he was busy filming and directing Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which Christopher Lloyd is also in. Just a weird little connection there, I feel like.
They must have had some kind of buddy relationship, like actor-director.
Which I will say, and I know we didn't talk about it much, but all the actors here portraying their roles just do such an incredible job. I mean, especially Michael J. Fox as Marty and Doc Brown, or as Christopher Lloyd as Doc Brown. I mean, those two on screen, honestly, I could watch them forever. In the first film, in this film, in the next film, they just have such a great relationship. The characters just play off each other so nicely. The actors really understand the roles and like the dynamic between those two characters. They have such a great chemistry, and that's why another portion of why you bringing up Jennifer reminded me. The other thing is like she just feels so ancillary to that relationship, even that it's like you don't even really get a good understanding of like their boyfriend-girlfriend relationship. I mean, she wasn't really in the first one that much, not truly, and then this one she kind of is just tagging along and not really having much of an impact at all. So generally I will say the like chemistry and relationship between those two primary characters is just so great to watch on screen.
You feel like you could watch them do anything, it's just like
truly,
really. And it's what I like about it is that they don't fight, like they'll bicker every now and again, but they don't make them fight all the time. And it's the same with the first film too. Like they're just you don't even really understand this. The first film never really gets into it, and this one doesn't either. I don't know why they're friends or how this happened. I mean, it's just kind of like they just are, but they really feel like they are. They feel like they understand each other so much, and they don't throw all this like character drama in there where it's not needed. It's just so nice to watch them. Like when they're together, it's going to be light. It's going to be fun. Even if there are high stakes, they just relate to each other, which I like a lot. And that's definitely still great in this movie. As good as the first. if not better. I mean, you do definitely get more moments with them together in this movie than you did in the first one. And the camaraderie between them is felt maybe even a little bit more in this one, which is definitely nice. And the other thing I wanted to mention that I really liked about this movie, same as the first, like, Robert Zemeckis, the directing of these movies is phenomenal. Like, and it still is here. It's so good. The visual presentation, while not as great as the first, is still so good. And just like the way that the editing and everything, it's so well done. These movies pace so well, they flow so well, scene to scene, shot to shot. It's so seamless. And he has there's such a great there's such a great feel for a light kind of action, well, not action, like, you know, adventure, sci-fi comedy or whatever for this movie, that they're so easy to watch. And I don't think that is different really with 2 than it is with 1.
Yeah, with that, I think we can kind of wrap it up here.
Yeah, sure, and I'll go first. Well, that's actually my final thoughts. Yeah, it's super fun still, really well directed, great acting, great characters, and a good story. But one that definitely isn't as airtight as the first film, one that relies a bit too much on the first film for me. And there are definitely some more unlikable elements in this movie than there were in the first, which is not to say there weren't any in the first, but not as many. All that said, though, I still thought it held up quite well. I would give it a 7. And I would recommend it. I definitely think you have to watch the first, though. Like, you have to. But I would highly recommend that, too. I mean, these are movies that everybody's seen except for me, so I don't even know why I should have to do that. But I do recommend it.
Yeah, and the Back to the Future trilogy is one of my favorite trilogies in film. Probably mainly for nostalgia reasons, but even still, I mean, this still holds up quite well. I don't know if I like this one or one more or less than the other, but I give this, after this recent rewatch, I give it probably an 8. I definitely recommend it. I think it's a super fun ride. Honestly, the whole trilogy is, and the trilogy is best served just watching straight through. Actually, part 3 was literally filmed right after the conclusion of the filming of this film. And what's funny is, I don't know if this is everywhere, but at least the way that I watched this movie most recently, they even have a stinger for the next film coming summer of 1990 at the very end, with scenes from the following movie.
That is just a part of the film. Yeah, that is a part of Back to the Future Part 2.
So yeah, I would definitely say, like, this trilogy is best served just watching all the way through. 3 is probably the weakest. Doesn't really go to as many fun places, although it's probably the most standalone of the 3. But with that being said, I definitely recommend Back to the Future Part 2.
All right, and that brings us to our recommendations, if you are ready for that.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so next episode, you're going to get some haunts. Okay, our annual spooks and haunts. We don't have a name for this. It's just scary, okay? And it's our anniversary event. The anniversary of Halloween. And you might see some friends. Now, I can't guarantee anything, but you might. So keep an eye out if you're, of course, on YouTube. And if you're on Castbox, you might hear us talking about some friends.
Yes. Of course, we'll have to do our seances and rituals to summon them, as we do every year on the anniversary of the podcast that is the Halloween podcast.
Yeah, the anniversary of Halloween.
Right.
Well, and we do a lot of preparation. There will be a lot of intense, agonizing, spectral events that Stephen and I will be partaking in to prepare for our next episode. But with all of that said, each Halloween, on the anniversary of Halloween, of All Hallows Eve, we recommend horror to each other. Now, does it have to be a horror film? No, it doesn't. Anything scary. And that's completely up to our discretion, or horror themed. And with that, I will begin. Stephen, for this Halloween, I am recommending the film Halloween from 1978, I believe. This is a film directed by John Carpenter. It is often considered or credited as being the birth of the slasher genre. It isn't technically the first slasher film, but it might as well be, because after this movie came out, every other slasher movie came out in the next like 5 years. Every other big franchise, and it all started with Halloween, starring Jamie Lee Curtis and the horror villain Michael Myers. And
Horror villain and renowned voice actor for Shrek, Michael Myers.
that is true. And maybe we'll re-rec Shrek as the follow-up to Halloween. That's
And
my
it's
recommendation.
actually kind of crazy. John Carpenter was so ahead of his time that he was able to predate the very first anniversary of Halloween. He actually created a movie, and actually, what most people don't know is that movie. Then every year, that's why we celebrate Halloween.
It's true, yeah. And the theme song is the theme song of Halloween.
Yeah, the official Halloween theme song
Of Halloween.
of Halloween. Okay, well, I am going to also recommend to you a film. This film is probably less spooky and more comedy, but it's also scary. And that film is Shaun of the Dead. Shaun of the Dead film written and directed by Edgar Wright, also Simon Pegg. They're probably most firstly known for this film, but also did a couple other films together, such as Hot Fuzz. Kind of parodies of genre films. Shaun of the Dead was a 2004, I believe. Yeah, 2004 film. And it's about the zombies.
Which is pretty scary.
Yeah.
And that pretty much does it for this week's episode, and definitely be looking forward to that spooky haunts that will be happening next time. In the meantime, you can check us out on Castbox if you're here on YouTube. On Castbox, we put all these episodes up after they come out at some point. If you download the Castbox app, you can listen to us on the go. And if you are listening on Castbox, you can find us on YouTube. It is the YouTube channel Casting 404. We actually stream these episodes live with a tiny bit of visuals. For the next episode, the visuals are going to be more important, so you definitely might want to catch that if you can. And that's usually all I have to say, and that's all I have to say this time also.
Thank you, everyone, for listening, as always. And look forward to spooky time.
Yeah, and with that, those were our thoughts. Those were our recommendations. Get wrecked.